Welcome back to Kiev. Let's talk in more detail now about the possible consequences of Vladimir Putin's move to put Russia's nuclear deterrence forces on high alert. I'm joined now by Trevor McCrisken, who is from Warwick University and has written about nuclear deterrence and is a former chair of the British American Security Information Council. Thank you very much for being with us. So, in practical terms, what does what he has done mean?
Well, I think what Putin is trying to do is remind the West, remind the United States in particular, but also its other NATO allies, that it does have these nuclear weapons and that Putin perhaps is ready to use them under circumstances that might fall short of an actual nuclear attack upon Russia, which is the kind of circumstance under which the general expectation is that nuclear weapons would be used. Russia has always been fairly ambiguous about what circumstances might be that it might use its nuclear arsenal under. And obviously that is one of the reasons why, and the major reason actually, why the United States and other NATO allies are not intervening directly in Ukraine. But I think what Putin is trying to do here is project the notion that he may even threaten that use of nuclear weapons short of the US actually intervening or any other NATO nation intervening directly in Ukraine, and trying to sow some doubt over whether the supply of weaponry, the moving of forces to the eastern flank of NATO to reinforce it, even the economic sanctions, whether that might be termed by the Kremlin eventually as being provocative enough to use the full weight of its capabilities by way of response. So I think that's what he's trying to do here, is really sow some doubt among those NATO allies as to exactly what position he might take over this nuclear arsenal that he has.
Yeah, I mean, he's connecting it to the sanctions, isn't he? But you think there might be a connection to his, what seems to be a kind of frustrated invasion at the moment?
Well, I think he's very worried about the degree to which the invasion has actually brought together NATO's allies. I mean, he made all sorts of demands of NATO prior to this invasion, suggesting that the US should withdraw many of its forces from Europe, if not all of them, and that those NATO countries in the eastern part of Europe that were once satellite countries of the Soviet Union, or indeed were part of the Soviet Union, that they should all withdraw from NATO. Of course, what's happened is completely the opposite of that, that there seems to be a much greater degree of unity within NATO now, a movement of forces towards that eastern flank to reinforce it against any possible future action by Russia. And so this is sort of, I think really Putin just signaling that, a reminder to those in the West that if there was a confrontation, that it could end up in a much wider war, much more difficult conflict that could ultimately turn nuclear. And of course, that's therefore reasserting the point that nuclear deterrence is really at the center of why the US and other allies are not intervening, as I say, directly into Ukraine. But of course, there have been such strong statements about the US, the UK, other European nations, and even those outside of NATO sending further military aid to Ukraine. This is something that is obviously contrary to the sort of interests of Russia. They don't want the Ukrainian army to become any stronger than it is already, and so he's trying, I think, by making this threat of upping the alert level of the nuclear forces. It's not saying I'm about to use them, but it's just a reminder and a suggestion that perhaps if that kind of intervention that isn't direct but is indirect through the supply of weaponry, that might then force Russia's hand into seeing those as potential acts of war, and then creating a wider conflict with the West. And of course, both sides, you'd like to think, would like to avoid that, because the costs that would be involved in that would be absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah, and how do you think the West should react to what he's done today?
Well, I mean, the United States has already said that this is a really unnecessary step, and that it's an escalatory step that's being taken by Putin by making this order and verbalizing these threats in this way. The United States could increase its own alert levels, but the suggestions that I've read so far, at least, are that won't be happening. They feel that they've got, even at a low level of alerts, with a sufficient amount of their nuclear forces is ready to go, as it were, and that should provide sufficient deterrence against any Russian threats on the nuclear front, and also in terms of conventional force, that they should understand that they cannot attack a NATO country, because the Article 5 collective defense would be brought into being, and then that could put Russia at war with the West, which presumably they don't really want to have happen. But one of the consequences that we might see is that the Biden administration, which was very keen actually on trying to increase its arms control discussions with Russia and try and minimize the threats of the use of nuclear weapons in the future, we've already seen a step back from that. I think it's now highly unlikely that we're going to see.
I'm going to have to interrupt you, I'm afraid, Trevor, because we've run out of time. But listen, thank you very much for being with us. Appreciate your time. And we will have much more from Ukraine at the top of the hour.